right. Well, today we're in the fifth part of a series called Influencers. If you're new here, we like to take our messages every week and we group them together in what we call a series under some common theme. And we're talking about influencers, not those wonderful people on social media that try to get us to buy stuff, or like teach us things. So they're great. Wonderful. We're talking about people who have made a difference in the world, in the lives of people around them, specifically because of the things that they believe. Now, just to catch you up a little bit, if you haven't been with us here the past couple weeks, I don't know about you, but for me, for a long time, faith, God, that whole umbrella of spiritual things didn't really make much of a difference in my life on a practical level, right? So like, anybody ever do 23andMe? Or like one of those DNA ancestry things, where you ship all your information away and now they keep it in some database somewhere and they know everything about you. So we did one of those, and it tells you your countries of origin. It's pretty interesting. I got it back. I didn't find out anything too, groundbreaking or dramatic. Just kind of found out, okay, you got some family here, family there, and that was kind of the end of it. And it didn't have much practical significance, right? For me, for a long time in my life, you might as well have added religion to the list of things about me, right? It's just like one of those things. It determined what holidays I celebrated. It determined what my parents believed, what my relatives believed. But for me, it didn't really make much of a difference practically in my life. Until I got a little bit older, started asking questions and learning about other people who were reading the same things I was reading, who were taught the same things in church that I was taught, but they applied it in a way that was inspiring, life-changing, motivating. And it really blew my mind. It took my understanding of faith from impractical to completely inspiring and motivating. So we've been talking about those people over the past couple weeks. This has been kind of an untraditional series, but really we're just talking about people who believed this stuff and changed because of it. So to catch you up, the first week we talked about somebody named William Wilberforce. If you're not sure who he was, he lived in England, and he was a really influential, famous, well-known, wealthy politician. And then he became a follower of Jesus. He learned about who Jesus was, and he believed it. He was convinced, okay, this guy's the real thing. And so his question was, okay, do I just cut myself off from the world and become a monk or a priest or a super religious, I don't know, right? Or do I take what I believe and use it in the life that I have built for myself here, where he was? And he did. He stayed where he was. But he allowed his faith to inform that. And eventually, William Wilberforce, if you don't know the story, he went on to abolish the slave trade in England. Eventually, he spent 43 years working on it, but eventually he outlawed slavery because of his work, largely because of his work. Slavery was outlawed in England, and eventually that trickled over to the United States. He was a huge part of that. His faith was a huge part of it. And so the question we asked, looking at his life, was, well, how about you? What if you are the way you are, in the place you are, at the time you are, for a reason? What if there's a purpose to the position you're in? If you were to believe this stuff, how might that change what you're doing? How might that inform the position that you're in? And how different would the world be if William Wilberforce didn't ask him this question? The next week, we talked about someone named Corrie ten Boom. If you don't know her story, she was around in the Netherlands. She lived in the Netherlands, and she just lived a life of love and selflessness. She was always looking out for other people. She opened up her home. She took care of kids. She tutored kids. And eventually, during the Holocaust, she opened up her home to over 800 Jewish people who were looking for refuge. And because of that, she was sent to a concentration camp. And her loved ones lost their lives. And she didn't. She made it out. There was a clerical error. But even after she got out, she went around talking about forgiveness and teaching people about who Jesus was. She was constantly living out of concern for the people around her. And I don't know about you, but when I heard her story, the question I was asking myself was like, would I do this? Like, why would she do it? Why would she open up her home, put herself in danger? The question is, what do you do when nothing's in it for you? If she had stopped to ask herself that question, like, what's in it for me? She would have not accomplished anything that she did. So what if we started to think a little more like that? The next week, we talked about someone named Jackie Robinson. If you haven't heard of him, he was the first black person to play in Major League Baseball. He paved the way for so many people after him. And a lot of people don't know he was a person of faith, and that's why he was asked to be the first black person in Major League Baseball. Somebody believed in him, knew of his faith, and knew that he would be, though it would be hard, he had the strength to turn the other cheek. And while most people don't think of turning the other cheek as something that is potentially world-changing, it was. And the question we asked was, what does strength look like to you? We talked about this idea of power under control. Then last week, Tom talked about someone named Susanna Wesley. Susanna Wesley. It was the day before Tom's birthday last week. He's 40 now. It's exciting. Susanna Wesley, there's this, she lived an incredible life. She was a mother. She raised a ton of kids. And there's this letter that she wrote to her husband, who wasn't around at the time, but she referred to her children as lives that had been entrusted to her. She referenced a talent, which is a story that Jesus told. But it was like she had been given something to take care of. And her kids were about 7 years old at that point, but she saw it as like a divine responsibility. And those kids grew up to be John and Charles Wesley. Two people, if you don't know their story, they changed the world. And she wrote that when they were like 7 years old. So the question we asked was from her life, what will you do with what's been given to you? Or maybe more appropriately for her story, the question is, what will you do with who's been given to you? Maybe you're a parent and you have kids, and you're in a similar position she was, or maybe not. Maybe there are people in your life that you have the ability to influence. Maybe it's people you work with. Maybe it's people you live with. Maybe it's people around you, your neighbors, your boss, your teacher, your fellow students. What kind of influence do you have in their lives? How do you handle the moments you have with them? And then Tom gave us this quote. I thought this was so perfect, inspiring. Looking at her life, the conclusion that we came to is that your greatest impact on the world may not be something you accomplish, but someone you influence. Crazy thing to think about. So we're looking at someone else today, someone who's extremely influential. There's a movie made about him. But before I tell you who we're talking about, there's a question I want you to start out with. And this question is something you kind of have to be honest about. Because it's easy, especially if you've been in church for a long time, to just kind of jump to the answers, the textbook answers that you know are right on paper. But on a gut level, emotionally, if you believe in God, the question is, what does it take to make God happy? Think about that. If you were going to try and make God happy, what would you do? What would you have to do? Or maybe you're not there. Maybe you don't believe in God, you don't believe in Jesus, and you're here because someone threatened you or forced you, and you're just excited for this to end. Let's pretend. Let's pretend there is a God. Just humor me. What do you think he would want? What would it take to make God happy? What kind of things come to mind? Like, what kind of feelings rise to the surface? Are they exciting? Are they boring? Obligation? Like, for me, A lot of these things are like religious things, you know? Maybe I'll like fast, you know, give up a lot of things. God must love that. Or I'll pray for a long time or read lots of the Bible. You know, do those things, spend a lot of time, and then God will be like, nice job, I'm happy. Right? Growing up, those are things that came to mind for me. But really, honestly, what is it for you? And what kind of emotions do you feel? How does that relate to the things in life that you love? Okay, so hold that thought. Here's the person we're talking about today. His name was Eric Liddell. Eric Liddell. Anyone ever heard of Eric Liddell? All right, a few of us. Eric Liddell, people that were in the first service. Eric Liddell was born in 1902, and he passed away young. He passed away in 1945. He was born in China, but he was actually Scottish. His parents were Scottish missionaries. They were people that lived in China to teach people about Jesus. And Eric grew up in a home of faith. He had a faith of his own. He had a relationship with God. He believed that Jesus was who he said he was. And then he did what he said he would do. And this was a huge part of his life, even from a young age. Now, something you need to know about Eric is that he was fast. He was a runner. He was a rugby player, but more famously, he ran track and field. And he was like very, very fast, like known nationally, eventually worldwide for being so fast. And he had a reputation for doing things that seemed miraculous. Like there was this one time, he was running a race. It was the 400-meter race, which is one lap around the track, or 4 football fields, about. And the gun goes off. He takes off and starts running, and he gets tripped up by another runner, and he falls down. And everyone else continues to run. And there's a gap that's opened up that's 20 meters long. Now, if you know track, you know every step counts, right? And he's behind 20 meters. And instead of quitting, which would have been the reasonable, logical thing to do, he gets up and he begins to run. And he begins to run fast. And eventually, he closes this gap and wins the race. And people couldn't believe it. There's a movie, it's called Chariots of Fire. It's about his life. You could see this kind of play out in the movie, and it really is a miraculous thing. What you don't know or hear about in the movie is that he pushed himself so hard in that race that he actually damaged muscle tissue and didn't win another race for the rest of the year. But he had the ability to just like turn it on and go into a different mode. And so he was fast. Right? Well, he was extremely successful, and eventually he got to the place where he was given the opportunity to run in the Olympics. Now, his race, the race he was the favorite for, the one he trained for the most, was the 100-meter. It's like an all-out sprint, the length of a football field, right? Somewhere between 10 and 11 seconds. Not a very long race. That was his event. And so he was the favorite, not just for Scotland, but for the world. Like he was expected to win the gold medal. The only problem for him was that the qualifying heat to run in this race was on a Sunday. And for him, at that time, at that stage in his faith journey, he wouldn't run on a Sunday. And so he chose not to run. And he gave up the opportunity to win the gold medal in the 100. Disappointed a lot of people. His Scotland freaked out. They tried to convince him to run. They couldn't convince him to run. Then they stopped trying to convince him. They went to the Olympic Committee and they're like, you got to make some exception. You got to change the day of the qualifiers. This is because of his beliefs. But they wouldn't. And so he didn't run the 100-meter race. And this is what got him, this is one of the reasons why he was so well known. Now, let me pause for a second, all right? Little disclaimer. And I was even hesitant to talk about Eric Liddell today for this reason. What I'm not saying is that it's wrong to play sports on Sunday, right? Or we wouldn't have the NFL, right, and all that, right? And I would argue that Eric Liddell doesn't believe that either. Later on in life, years later, he reffed a youth soccer game on a Sunday. And so he didn't have a problem specifically with things happening on a Sunday, but for him personally, at that point in his life, he personally believed it would be self-serving and wouldn't be a good idea for him to run on a Sunday for whatever reason. And so he doesn't. Now, if we go back to our question, remember how we started? What does it take to make God happy? Here you have someone who loves to run. And if you're looking at his story from the outside, what it appears is going on here is this guy, he's got the world at his fingertips. He can win the gold medal. He can be world famous. And yet God steps into his situation. What he believes enters into the equation, and that's over. God, the cosmic killjoy, has come to reign on the parade. And what it seems like is that, and where a lot of us go, when we think of what it takes to make God happy, we go to things like obedience and sacrifice. I gotta listen to God, I gotta do what he says, and I gotta give up the things that I love. And there's a God up there who seems to be happy when I do that. At least for me, growing up, that was the operating belief within me. I've got to listen to God. He's going to make me do things I don't want to do. He's going to make me go places I don't want to go. And somehow that's going to make him happy. In fact, I never would have articulated it like this, but I was functioning with the belief that my willingness to be unhappy makes God happy. It's like a display of devotion. Here, I'll give up the things that give me joy, that I love, and maybe now you'll be happy with me. And that trend carried over into other areas of life, right? It was for me, Christmas Eve, I'm with my cousins, we're playing board games, we're eating food, it's wonderful and fantastic, and then it's stop the party, we're going to church. And God comes into reign on the parade. Or, growing up, all my friends had sleepovers. We'd watch scary movies. But on Saturday nights, I couldn't. Why? I got to church in the morning. And so sacrifice and obedience. Do what God says. And that's what it seems like is going on in Eric Liddell's story. God, the cosmic killjoy, has come to take all the fun. I don't want to spoil it for you, but I will a little bit. Eric Liddell, he ends up not running the 100. Instead, he runs the 400. Instead of running one football field, he runs 4, one full lap around the track. Now, if you know track, it's a very, very different race. It takes a different kind of conditioning. You could be very good in the 100 and very bad in the 400, and the other way around as well. It's a different type of stamina. But he did it. He decided to run that race. And he was not the favorite. In fact, earlier that day, the world record was broken in the 400 meter. And so it had just been run, the fastest it had ever been run, and here he is running for Scotland in a race that's not his own. They draw lanes, and he gets the outside lane, which is the worst lane to run in because you can't see your competitors. You start a little ahead of them, and you can't pace yourself. And so he starts out on the outside, the gun goes off, and he takes off running, and he's running at the pace of a 100-meter race. And his friends are watching, and they see he's blown it already. He's pushing it too hard. But he doesn't slow down. And eventually, he ends up winning the race. He wins the gold medal for Scotland, and he breaks the world record. It was unbelievable. No one expected him to do it. They interviewed him afterwards, and they were like, so how'd you do it? He was like, well, the first 200 meters, I ran as fast as I could. And then the second 200 meters, with God's help, I ran a little faster. It's well, it's a pretty complex strategy, right? But he did it. Now, again, that's how his story ends, and I want you to know because it's a cool ending. But the lesson here is not that if you choose to sacrifice and obey, that you're going to win gold medals. because that's not promised. He very easily could have not won anything. What I want you to see is the way he understood running and how he understood how God saw his running. He was asked later on in life about what running was like to him. And he said this, and this quote here, this is one of those quotes I heard years ago, and it changed the way I understood God forever. He said, I believe God made me for a purpose, but he also made me fast. He says, and when I run, I feel his pleasure. For Eric Liddell, the answer, what does it take to make God happy? For him, it was when he ran, when he was doing what he loved. In fact, his decision not to run was just as spiritual a decision as every other race that he ran for him. He believed he had been made for a purpose, that the things he had been given, he was given for a reason. And when he did it, when he did what he loved, it was something that brought pleasure to God. You know, if you're, again, like me, right? We have these boxes, right? I've got like a box of things that just frankly stink. Like there's the dentist in that box. No offense if you're a dentist. There's like, you know, the doctor. There's all these things, vitamins, things you just gotta do that we keep in there. And for a long time for me, God was in that box. Like, all right, yeah, we probably should go to church just in case there's someone actually up there. You wanna make sure you're gonna be okay if you die, and you know, you want things to go. And so it's like a just in case insurance policy, and we stick God in there. But for Eric Liddell, it was totally different. Like there were the things that he loved, and he saw God as the source of what he loved. And he believed when he was doing what made him feel alive, it was something that God found joy in. Like what if when you felt most alive, those were the things, those were the moments you connected with experiencing God? What if when you paint, if you're a painter, you felt his pleasure? What if when you teach, if you're a teacher, you felt his pleasure? If you're a designer, a salesperson, an athlete, a student, a parent, what if those were those things that give us joy, that just, they give us joy and they don't give other people joy? I can't explain why I love this thing. What if when we did that, that's when our minds drifted in the direction of God? Rather than I've got to give this up, I've got to stop doing this, I've got this obligation to fulfill. Why? God. You know, the thing that Eric Liddell understood is something that Jesus taught over and over and over and over again. When he showed up, he changed the way people thought about God. People who saw God as this distant, formal, like powerful being, the rule giver, Jesus introduced as a loving father over and over and over again. In fact, he almost exclusively refers to Jesus as father, or refers to God as father. It's almost the only title he uses for God. And he invites his followers to do the same thing. And he's like, when you're wondering how God feels, I want you to think about how a father would feel. There's this one time where he's teaching about prayer, and he's like, just ask. You need something? Ask, knock. If it's a door, knock. He's like, just ask God and he'll give you what he needs. He wants to, he cares. And it's as if he stops to help people understand the emotional weight of it, the emotional side of it. Like everyone who's sitting there, like, what does he mean? We just ask God if we need something? Like, what's on the other side of my prayers? He's like, okay, think about it like this. If you're a parent and your kids ask for something, how do you respond? Do you want to give them what they need? Do you want to give them what they want? Are you concerned about what's best for them? He says, who of you, if your child asks for bread, would give him a stone? And then he stops, he says this. He says, if you then, nope, there we go. If you then, he says, though you are evil, which is not an insult. He's saying, though you're broken, though you've got issues, though you're impatient, though you've had it up to here, though you can't take it anymore, though you've got your shortcomings, and you know how to give good gifts to your kids, how much more? How much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? He's like, if you want to know what it feels like, think about it that way. If you want to know what's going on in the heart of God, think about what's going on in your heart when your kids ask you. And if you don't have kids, pretend you do. Think about it like that. And this is perfect. Like, when you see it through that lens, we can go right back to that question in the beginning. Like, what does it take to make God happy? What would it take to make a holy God, we could say, right? God up there in a category all on his own. What would it take to make him happy? Jesus would say, if you want to know, really a good question, maybe not perfect every single time, but 99% of the time, you could ask, what would it take to make a good dad happy? And you'll arrive at how God feels. Like, think about it like this. What would it take to make a good dad happy? Is the answer obedience and sacrifice? Sometimes it is. But it is always for the good of your children. And you're not sitting there like, oh yeah, here they go. They're doing that stuff that they hate, right? You ask them to do things because they have to. Because as a good parent, you know, sometimes they need to do the hard thing. And sometimes they need to give up what they love for their good. But God doesn't find joy in your discomfort. He's not happy when you're unhappy, though he will allow you to be for your good because he cares. If we're going to say this, that obedience and sacrifice sometimes is what would make a good dad, God, happy, you also have to say it sometimes. It's quite simply, it's just joy, your joy. Like when you see a child, or if you don't have kids, if you can imagine seeing a child that's been trusted to you, just experiencing joy in the purest form, that brings you joy. And so what if we we allowed God to enter that box in our lives? And we didn't just think of him when we're like, I really should get to church. You know, I really should, I guess, read the Bible or maybe pray. Like, do that spiritual, religious thing, like that's when God comes to mind. What if you're gonna go out on a boat this afternoon, what if you do it with the wind in your face, knowing that God feels pleasure in the pleasure you're experiencing? Rather than thinking, okay, we fulfilled our obligation, now let's go actually have fun. What would that look like? How would that change the way you understand God? So, like, my challenge for you this week is to find yourself in a moment of pure joy in the most unspiritual of things. And allow yourself to sense God's pleasure. Like, to know it's okay that I'm not praying or singing a worship song right now. I just love doing this puzzle or whatever. And no, there's joy in that. It's a spiritual thing. You know, Tom playing the guitar, him playing a song up here in church can be just as spiritual as him playing a U2 song in his backyard at home with his kids. I'm gonna ask him to come back up here, and the rest of the band. But here's a story I'll leave you with. This actually coincidentally just happened. So my son, Logan, he's 7 years old. He's going to second grade. And he's preparing for second grade. And we were given a list of words he's got to know going to second grade. Now, he doesn't love reading just yet. He likes building, he likes a lot of things. He's not crazy about reading or spelling. But we know we got to work on this list. And so this list has just been in our kitchen, just collecting dust. There's 100 words on the front, 50 words on the back, 15 lists in total. And so, we're trying to get him to learn these words. He's not really into it. Well, he comes up to my wife and I the other day, and he's like, hey, my friend has this game, and I want to get it. It's a video game where you build stuff. And he's like, can I get it? I'm like, no, we're not just going to get you like a video game just because, And he's like, please. And he's going on. And so finally I'm like, all right, you know what, Logan? See this list? If you can learn the words on this list, be able to read the words on this list before school starts, I'll get you that game. And he looks at the list, and he looks up at my wife and I, he goes, all of them? I was like, yeah, all of them. And then his eyes just start to tear up. And he shakes his head and he goes, okay. And he walks away. And it just broke my heart watching him do that. My wife and I look at each other like we just wanted to get him the game. But we didn't. He needed to obey us. He didn't have a choice. But we were asking him to sacrifice, to go without something that he knew he was going to love. It would be upsetting to me if somehow I found out he thought I liked doing that to him. I liked watching him sacrifice. That was the stuff that makes me happy. No, I'll make him do it because I love him. But I don't find joy in that. And you can bet that even after doing that hard thing, the next thing I did was follow him into the room with the list and say, let's go. We're going to do this together. And I did, and my wife did, and we even bribed my daughter to help read the list to him. And he went through it, and every day knocked off another list and another list, until he finally knocked it out. And when he got to that last list, you can bet that the moment he read that final word, the game was in my pocket, and I was ready to pull it out. And now he plays the game. And my hope for him is that when he plays, he feels my pleasure because I find joy in his joy. And there are times I may need to ask him to do the hard thing, to sacrifice, to do something he doesn't like. But it's out of concern for him. It's out of love for him. And so this week, however you run, my hope for you is that you'll feel his pleasure.